Hey, what's up, APUSH kids? We're back for our next lecture here in APUS History. Today we're going to be covering topic 6.5, Industrial Empires. We have two learning objectives that we're going to be learning about today, Objective 6D and 6E. 6D says, explain the effects of technological advances in the development of the United States over time. And 6E says, explain the socioeconomic continuities and changes associated with the growth of industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898. Well, let's first tackle that technological advances, and that brings us to key idea number 1, which says businesses made use of technological innovations and greater access to natural resources to dramatically increase the production of goods. So to start off with, during the Gilded Age, the United States experienced an industrial revolution. Westward expansion during the previous time period had increased the availability of natural resources. Natural resources important to industrial revolution, such as oil in places like Texas and the unorganized Indian territories, coal in the Midwest, and iron ore in places like northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. In addition to this, the Civil War had stimulated mass production techniques that were used after the war to make industrial goods rather than wartime goods. Additionally, industrial goods like iron, steel, and railroads were needed to rebuild the nation after the war and rebuild new American cities. Now, not only did we have new production techniques and a need for new production as well as new resources, but new technologies also played an important role in this industrial revolution. The graph that you see there at the bottom is the number of U.S. patents issued. A patent is issued whenever you come up with a new invention. And so we can see that as we move throughout the time period, we have lots of new inventions and innovations that are coming online in the United States during this particular time. Some of those inventions are pictured here and are similar to many of their types that we have today. Things such as the cash register, typewriter, adding machines, essentially an early version of a calculator. Now, these were all really important to businesses as it made them more efficient at doing their particular jobs. In addition to this, new communication technologies were incredibly important as well and helped facilitate business as well as commerce, such as Marconi's wireless transmitter and Bell's telephone helped to revolutionize communication. On top of this, we also have new ways of making things. For instance, the Bessemer process helped to create a new cheap way to transform iron into a stronger version, which was lighter as well, and that was steel. Now, all of these put together allowed for improved industrialization in the United States. But of all of these different inventions, there was no person that was more important to the inventions than Thomas Edison, otherwise sometimes known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. And he was the greatest inventor of the 1800s. His Menlo Park Research Laboratory, located in New Jersey, had many new inventions, including the first phonograph, which is a way to play records, the first audio recorder, as well as the first rechargeable battery. However, he's most famous, as you guys probably already know, for his most influential invention, and that was the first electric light bulb. Now, the light bulb had far-reaching commercial consequences beyond just the ability to light up a dark room. This had important industrial implications because now what you could do is you could light up a factory floor, and your factory now could go from being just operational during daylight hours to now you could have something that was operational 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so your industrial capacity as a shop owner now all of a sudden increased exponentially. Leading us then to key idea number 2 and 3. Key idea number 2 says, businesses made use of redesigned financial and management structures, advances in marketing, and a growing labor force to dramatically increase the production of goods. And key idea 3 says, many business leaders sought increased profits by consolidating corporations into large trusts and holding companies, which further concentrated wealth. And so what we're generally looking at is how did businesses grow during this particular time period. So what we see is that during this time period, we have 4 major industries at this time. American Industrial Revolution was fueled by these ROSE industries: railroads, oil, steel, and electricity. And the first one we want to talk about is railroads. And it was America's first big business. So let's just do a little bit kind of a history lesson, kind of go backwards just a little bit to set the historical context for the growth of American railroads. Now, railroad construction in the years prior to the Civil War had grown slightly. We can see the first railroads on the map in 1830 on the far left-hand map. By 1840, they're starting to expand. By 1850, we're starting to see a national network, or at least regional networks, really kind of start to develop. But generally, railroad tracks were owned by different companies, and they were not standardized. Now, what that meant is that the standard, or the gauge, that's the distance between the two tracks, was actually different. Meaning that if your railroad car was on one set of railroad tracks, it couldn't transfer to another one because the difference in the width of the wheels was either too wide or too narrow. Now, what we are going to see is during the Gilded Age, that's that time period that we're in now, the time period after the Civil War and Reconstruction, railroad construction is going to boom. And one of the biggest players in this construction boom is the tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, he's going to buy out many small railroads, and what we see is not just him, but also other major players in the field as railroads as well. They're going to buy out small railroads. They're going to standardize the gauges, so the differences between those rails are going to be equal, so cars can go kind of anywhere in the country. The schedules will become standardized. There will pool cars. And essentially what we're going to see is that this is going to develop into a large national transportation network, which is fairly important during this time. And because of this, all right, this leads to a boom in the economy. All right, and this is kind of a standard idea in U.S. history. We've talked about this before, is whenever you make transportation improvements, you then, after you create transportation improvements, you get economic growth. We saw that with the development of Henry Clay's American system. When the Erie Canal was built, it's after that that we see economic growth in the United States. We're going to see this again in the 1950s and again at the turn of the century when we see transportation improvements are leading to then economic growth. And this happens because railroads are going to connect the East, the South, and the West, and they allow for national trade as well as regional specialization. Now, as we've already mentioned, the first transcontinental railroad was finished in 1869, built by two large immigrant groups, including the Irish, who built the eastern half of the railroad, and the Chinese, who built the western half. And as we can see, that map is starting to spread. Now it's 1880. We can see how those railroad networks are starting to grow. And these railroad networks, east and west, are connected by four major lines, four major trunk lines, including the Central Railroad, the Erie, all right, the B&O, and the Reading Railroad. Yes, the ones from the Monopoly Board, all right, are the ones that are there. And there's the map from 1890. We can see those concentration of railroads becoming even thicker and thicker across the United States. This is now the 1890 map. And because of this stimulates the need for coal, iron, steel, all of these are the products to go into making the railroads, into building up the cities. And this industrialization leads to a demand for iron and steel. Now, steel leads to lots of things: new skyscrapers, longer bridges, stronger railroads, heavier machinery, and that iron and steel industry is dominated by the man that you see there. His name was Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie dominates this entire industry. He's going to convert his mills to the Bessemer process, and he makes the highest quality steel in the country, and he also makes it at the lowest price. He's got the cheapest stuff, and it's the best stuff that's out there. It's like going to Walmart, getting that, great value brand, and it's better than the name brand stuff. That's what his stuff was. Now, the Carnegie Steel Company produces more steel than all the steel factories in Great Britain combined. And Carnegie really represents the American dream. He is an immigrant, and he comes from a very poor background, and he ends up becoming, at least during his time period, the richest man in the world. Though he won't be for long. He will be surpassed soon. We can see where he's getting kind of his coal and steel from. He's located mostly out of Pittsburgh, which is maybe why it's called the Steelers. I don't know, maybe. All right. However, this industrialization also leads to the desire for more oil as well. Oil was needed for a few things: a lubrication for all these new machines, as well as kerosene for lighting. Now, interestingly enough, the byproduct of making kerosene is gasoline, which they didn't need at the time because we didn't have cars yet. They just usually dumped that out into the local rivers. Millions and billions of gallons of gasoline, unneeded at the time. Now, likewise, the oil industry is also dominated by a single individual. And this individual is a man named John Rockefeller. And he owns a company called the Standard Oil Company. Now, he is incredibly ruthless. He buys out competing companies, but he is also able to, through the fact that he's able to perfect the way that he makes it, as well as the way that he transports it, is that he's able to lower the cost of Standard Oil. And he also improves the quality of its product. He calls it Standard Oil because it sets the standard. It's supposed to be the best that's out there, and oftentimes it was the cheapest. Now, because of his high quality, because of his low cost, and because of his ruthless tactics, by 1879, Standard Oil controlled 90% of the oil production in the United States. And in fact, today, most oil companies are the descendants of that Standard Oil Company. Later on, we're going to learn how the Standard Oil Company is going to be forced to break up into 16 separate companies, including companies that you may have heard about today, such as Texaco, Conoco, Phillips, ExxonMobil, were all parts of the Standard Oil Company at one time. Now, a third giant of innovation at this particular time was a guy named J.P. Morgan. And industrialization is going to create the need for financing, essentially a large bank to finance these big corporations when they want to do really big things. And J.P. Morgan and his company, which becomes known as J.P. Morgan Chase, and you may have heard of Chase Bank, which is part of his financial empire, was a major player at this particular time. J.P. Morgan was so influential that not only does he bail out the railroad industry when it gets into trouble, but during the Panic of 1907, he actually bails out the national government, which is pretty amazing. Now, he's not as personally rich as the other two men. John Rockefeller would die as the wealthiest person to ever live. Carnegie was worth several $100 billion during his particular time period, adjusted for inflation. J.P. Morgan never amassed a fortune of more than $35 million, which was several hundred million today, nearly $1 billion. To which Andrew Carnegie had once replied, "And to think, I thought he was a rich man." But all of these guys together, such as Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, changed the way that businesses were organized. Businesses, because as they grew, they needed to hire professional managers. These professional managers were overseeing employees. They improved efficiency, managed finances, things like that. And these big businesses were so about efficiency that these managers were needed. And so this leads into this common business structure of the corporation, where we see shareholders, boards of directors, CEOs, executives, and finally workers. And these board of directors use what was called, sometimes known, board of trustees or trusts to manage the entire company. And so this is essentially the business practice that we start to see. And so because of the size, and this really started first with the railroads, is we had to structure and organize these new companies in very, very different ways. In addition to this, one of the other things that they started to do is they started to control multiple companies as well. And they're holding on to multiple companies and managing those multiple companies and subsidiaries of each other. And this is a very modern way. I'll give you a great example. If you look at the Disney Corporation is a good example of this that you're probably aware of. As many of you know, you have Disney, which owns, the parks and its movie studios, but there's all of the other things that Disney owns as well, including things such as the ABC network, and ABC owns ESPN. You also have Marvel Studios, you have the Fox Studios. Those are all incorporated under that entire Disney Universal kind of logo that you have there. And so that, how businesses are organized today, like Disney is how these companies first start to organize these major businesses. In addition to this, corporations use mergers to increase profits. And there was two general ways to create mergers to increase profits. The first one was oftentimes called horizontal integration. And organizations like Standard Oil use this practice. And what this is you buy out similar companies to reduce competition. So for instance, we can see from the chart in horizontal integration is that Standard Oil would buy out all of the other refining companies that were out there. So they were the only company that really refined oil. They would buy oil from different drilling companies, and transportation would be handled by various companies, and sales and distribution may be by another. But only Standard Oil would actually make the oil and refine it into a usable product. You had to go through them. Thus, they could control the industry. A second way to merger is what we call vertical integration. And Carnegie Steel used this to buy out their basically what we would call their supply chain today. And they would control everything needed to make their particular product. So they wouldn't necessarily buy out other smelting companies or other transportation companies or other mining companies. But Carnegie Steel would own their mines. They would own the transportation. They would own the smelting, the refining, the rolling. They would control every single part of the process from the ore coming out of the ground to it actually being made into a usable product. Now, these mergers are going to lead to giant corporations called monopolies that controlled the majority of an industry. And because most monopolies were run by boards of trustees, monopolies became known as trusts. And eventually some of the largest ones were accused of corruption. And as we can see in the image there, the Standard Oil, the monster monopoly, you see its tentacles reaching out to the different parts of government and controlling them as well. Well, that's all we have for today. In review, what we've covered so far today is we've looked at the different reasons for the rise of major businesses, including new technologies and access to natural resources. We've also looked at the rise of major early organizations such as railroads, oil, steel, electricity, and some of those major players within those particular organizations. We've also finally looked at how those organizations started to restructure themselves into modern corporations and merged with each other to create these mega organizations. Well, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. Until next time, go Pack.